when the soul of the dead person seems to be lost, takes upon itself the sin of the dead, and in that way gains its redemption. These old rites and mysteries go way back. Julian knew them. Julian had been through the sacred rites. He knew what their meanings were and what they portended in a world seeking truth. And so Isis is the great house, the house of God on earth. Isis was the many-roomed chambers of initiation, the dark hidden womb from which flow the ever-born ones, the sons of the hawk, the armies of the redeemed, who shall sometime in the last great war, which is the Armageddon, will be locked in eternal struggle with the powers of darkness, and in the end, in those times beyond eternity and time, right shall be victorious, and the kingdom shall be returned to Osiris the Father, who will come in glory and receive unto himself his beloved Son. All these rites are not the theological stories that we know today. They had a much deeper and more precious meaning to the initiates of that time. The great Diana, mother of the Ephesians, the brooding power of the moon, hovering over the great temple of Ephesus, was likewise this mysterious story of the psychic content and the building of the human soul, and how through the union of a Holy Spirit invisible and a corporeal body, the mother, there is born the radiant soul which is the salvation of the world. This in turn causes the initiate or the adeptus of the ancient rites to be considered as a personification and embodiment of the principal soul. Here we can pause for just a second and remind you of the heroic estate we described last week in the wanderings of Ulysses. The heroes are the soul beings, those who have built for themselves this house, this tabernacle within, which is to be their habitation. So through the power of the mysteries, the breath of life is breathed into a man and he becomes a living being. And this living being is the psychic entity, the mysterious energy or power of the soul. Julianus tells us some more of these things, and he points out something that I think is very interesting. He points out that in these rites, whether they be at Samothrace or Ephesus, whether they be among the Phrygians or in the mysteries of the Goths and the Gauls, all of these rites were presented in the forms of great pageantries. The pageantries of Eleusis are particularly remembered, but they were no more remarkable or important than those practiced in other places. The neophyte seeking admission into these rites, and having passed through certain preparatory examinations and tests, is brought into the ceremony, and there he is a witness. He is a beholder. What he was is perhaps borrowed from a line in Plato, because Plato, at initiate, was once asked his profession, and he replied, "I am a spectator." This means, of course, that he accepted the entire pageantry of life as a drama of initiation, although very few modern writers, including dear old Jowett, ever realized that fact. In the rituals, Apuleius, who preceded Julian in these rites, and Hadrianus, and Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, who also was initiated at Ephesus, all of these who went before joined with Julian in bearing testimony to something that is undoubtedly the secret and the very heart of the mystery. They all declared that when they entered into the temple as candidates for the mysteries or for initiation, that they actually went through an experience Apollonius of Tyana, at a still earlier date than these men, had testified to the same thing. Namely, that when they entered the house of the goddess, or the great house of the mother, that is, they returned to the womb for a second birth, that an occurrence or a happening took place which could not be explained in any terms or any words known to man. As the great drama of initiation unfolded, from the soul of the candidate, the story of the truth behind the picture was revived or restored. So that, as the ancient initiate said, the soul or the psychic entity within himself stirred in its sleep, awoke, and remembered the long road it had come, and realized the reason for its own journey. Thus, in some ways, the rituals brought about from the individual a restoration of his own psychic memory. There are many answers to how this could have been. Some of the profane and not too happy commentators on these subjects have suggested that the candidates were hypnotized, or that they were drugged, or that something was done to disorder their senses so that they seemed to pass through impossible situations. I doubt if either was true. I think the answer lies in the ritual itself. Remember, these rites were preserved inviolate, without change, upon the strongest admonition of the gods and the oracles. Not one line, not one motion, not one word could be altered. It must be preserved complete, inviolate. Man must add nothing and take away nothing. For the peculiar power of the rite lay in its own structure and the unfoldment which it accomplished. Those who have written briefly upon these ceremonies, particularly those who passed through them and could not say much, and some who arcanely concealed them under subterfuge and veiled term, particularly I'm thinking of the Grecian poet Aristophanes, who in his Frogs and his Winds, two of his supposed comedies, gives us part of the ritual. These rites unfolded according to a peculiar sequence. As Plotinus says, they opened like a flower and bore their fruit. The entire situation was so perfectly and completely ordered that in some mysterious way it brought about some of the chemistry, some of the psychic chemistry implied by Plotinus in his essay on the beautiful, which we have also described. In the rites, then, as in the approach of beauty, the soul in man was said to burst forth in joy, to embrace its own likeness. Thus the rituals were magnificent, integrated, psychological structures which could rouse through reminiscence, through recollection, through similarity, and through association, the sleeping remembrances that are locked within the psychic life of the individual. These rituals then called him forth out of the darkness of his own sleep and caused him to awaken. And while the rites were proceeding, he lived them, he experienced them, because they were unfolding in tone and order and picture and color and design the very structure of his own psychic life. He responded because they were revealing to him an absolute similitude of his own soul. A man being thus brought into the presence of that which is himself, and recognizing those patterns and pageantries which instinctively he receives and responds to by ancient instincts which he cannot even explain